Good morning, everyone. All righty. Well, I know we may have some people still trickling in this morning, but we don't want to waste any of our time getting started with our cafe today. First of all, thank you so much for joining us this June. I know summer season is starting to begin and we're sure feeling it this week. So we appreciate you spending time here with us this morning to talk about effective communications for teams. All right, so for those of you that have joined us before, you're probably familiar with our agenda. We're going to stick to our regular routine, but for those of you that are new joining us, what we're going to tackle today is a quick introduction and welcome to our panelists here today. We'll then dive right into our panel discussion. We always save some time for breakout discussion where we'll divide you into 3-4 groups where we'll have some one-on-one conversation. We'll then regroup after our breakout session to talk about some of the themes from the group, as well as save time for question and answer for our wonderful panelists here today. So without further ado, let's meet our panelists. I'm your host today, probably a familiar face for most of you that have attended before. I am Lisa Brown, the Vice President of Client Services here at HR Collaborative. And joining me are my wonderful colleagues, Debbie Lockwood, our COO and integrator here at HR Collaborative. Debbie is a talent management expert with more than 20 years of experience consulting on and implementing HR strategies. As COO and integrator, Debbie turns big ideas into action, drives meaningful business results, and removes organizational obstacles and barriers through clear and effective communication. And then Lisa Struck is our Director of Retained Services. She is a certified HR professional and brings a wealth of cross-industry experience to the table. Her approachable style and practical coaching endear her to business owners and operators who seek HR strategies that balance nurturing a supportive, inclusive, and high-performing workforce. So without further ado, let's dive into the conversation. All right, ladies. So we're talking about effective communication. We know communication is key at any organization, professionally, personally. So I think what most organizations are wondering is, where do you even start when you're thinking about effective communication?
Yeah. So good morning, everyone. Super excited to be part of the panel here. So building a company on clarity and communication is so crucial. So if we are all clear on where the company is going, what the company's about, who we are, and how do we interact with each other, those are kind of the building blocks, I would say, for the start of good communication. And I feel like we've been on that journey ourselves through HR Collaborative, creating a management structure to be able to foster that communication. One of the things I think we always hear about, some of the questions that we have for our counterparts and our clients, is to say, how do we get folks to feel really aligned with the mission? How do they feel aligned within their role, and how does their role play into the bigger piece of the organization? So if you think about driving that clear communication on what we are about, who we are, and how do we get things done. So the what is typically, if I'll use HR Collaborative as an example, what we do is we do HR solutions and talent for organizations, but our why, the why we do it is to make work better, right? And if we're intentionally creating an atmosphere that people feel connected to that mission and the why, circling it down to their actual role, what they do, how that bubbles up, is so crucial. And the next thing is to say, how do we do it? And that's usually about our values, right? So what are the building blocks of our values that drive the behaviors that ultimately creates the culture that we want to have? All things, those are the building blocks, are so crucial to drive a business. And then I go, probably where you start is to have that structure, that management structure that reinforces all three of those, and it's consistent. Right? It sounds really easy, but unless you have the intentionality of consistency messaging, where everybody's on the same page, reinforced. Some of the ways that we've done it here is quarterly meetings, right? Bringing everybody together, talking about our mission, talking about where we've been, where we are, and then most importantly, where we're going, right? Getting that alignment, and then trickling it down to team meetings on a weekly basis with set agendas and talking about how we're doing and functioning. But I think sometimes if we're not intentional about the clarity of what we discussed in our meeting, to go right to who else needs to hear this information, right? And it bubbles up, bubbles down, bubbles sideways, but it's intentional. So then again, builds clarity. And the more we build clarity, the less chaotic, the less uninformed I feel. So sometimes I think it's so much of building the structure for effective communication to happen.
Yeah, and I think the timing of that's really important too, right? Having the structure and, having everyone informed, in a good timing cadence, so people don't feel like they're left out of that communication, right?
Exactly. One of the things I think then part of our, challenge is to make sure, how do I, from the very beginning, someone starts with our organization, I think you're talking about how do we interact here, right? How does your role and your accountabilities, bubble up to the bigger mission? But it can't stop there, and it can't stop with a sign on the wall, or, we're always challenging ourselves to bring it to life. So, having one-on-one meetings, and we'll talk about probably a little bit more, but again, checking in. How is things going? Is there anything that is not clear, right? Let's talk about it. Open, honest, transparent are good building blocks for good communication.
Yeah, so that's really crucial. Anything to add? I've definitely got another question about, we talked about the structure.
Yeah.
But many of us are leaders or supervisors ourselves, or know we have teams of supervisors. And we know that they play a critical role in communication. What is that role, and how can they be effective as supervisors?
Yeah, sure. So I would say, if you think about the supervisor leadership role, there's really two big buckets when we think about communication. One is clarity about accountabilities and your role within the organization, right? So directing that performance and directing those accountabilities and keeping people on track. And then the other one is the connecting to the mission. So both of those things are really things that are critical for that supervisory level, and really require that being a conduit between what's happening above you as the supervisor for the mission and the goals, and then what's happening below you for the performance and the accountability piece. So our supervisors play such a huge critical role when it comes to effective communication.
Well, you talked a little bit about one-on-one meetings. What types of communication, or what are some things that supervisors can do to be effective in their communication?
I think sometimes it does sound simple, because if you really think about it, employees really want to be seen, they want to be heard, and they want to be cared for, right? If you really think about the engagement, like the Gallup Q12 questions, that really boils down to, I want to be seen, I want to be heard, and I want to be cared for. So I think if we look at those pieces, how do we really kind of focus in on those things as supervisors? If we're doing those things, then I think we're going well. So I think part of it is really developing a cadence for your team on communication. So is it one-on-ones? Is it one-on-ones weekly? Is it a team meeting weekly and maybe one-on-ones monthly? It really might depend on your organization and how fast communication needs to flow within the organization. I know we've played around with that in our company on how often do we need one-on-ones? How often do we need team meetings? How often do we do quarterly meetings or an all-staff meeting? Are those monthly? Are they quarterly? So I think, again, kind of coming at it from the high level structure and then boiling that down into each department will be really helpful for organizations.
I think just to add on to that is when you also think about the intentionality of the conversation as well, and how do we reinforce consistently. Probably as supervisors, it's hard not to let me lean in and do most of the communicating. And actually it's a time to kind of take a break and maybe lean back a little bit and let the staff as a person come to light, but within a great way to say, what's working, what's not, how are we aligning on our who, right? And all the values that we have, how are we aligning on expectations in the role? What do you see that's not working? And then most importantly, if we're not asking them, where do they want to go, or where do they want to keep growing? As we know, talent is always a critical issue, right? Finding great talent. Once you have great talent, as much as we possibly can to help them grow within the organization, how can we get you some potential training, upskilling? All happens within these crucial conversations.
Yeah, I think part of it for supervisors is we have to shift the mindset that effective communication is part of their accountability. So, I think a lot of times it's looked at as, here's the extra that I have to do. Like, oh, wait, now I have to do these extra meetings with one-on-ones or whatever it might be. And we have to, especially as HR leaders or leaders within an organization, we have to be very clear with our supervisors that effective communication and employee engagement is just as important, if not more important, than hitting your sales goal or your revenue target, right? Obviously, we need to make money, and I know, Debbie, that's true and dear to your heart and your role, right? But it's also the fact that engagement and effective communication is just as important as those things, because again, when we're looking at a scarce talent pool and the idea of people wanting to be engaged, communication plays such a huge role on that piece of it.
Absolutely. Most organizations, your talent is your biggest asset.
Yes,
Right? So how you're treating your talent, how you're engaging with your talent is a major driver of your business. So communicating that up to your leadership team, and how can we help the leaders to know exactly how important it is to be effectively managing, which, communicating intentionally is probably the most management skill they should have.
right.
Yeah, you mentioned that, we're talking about how supervisors engage and communicate to their staff. So there's the communication down, like cascading the message down, but how do we train supervisors to be effective, also communicating that feedback back up?
Yeah, I think part of it is really, again, setting that expectation for them, so that they understand that they are the conduit between the up and the down, right?
Yeah.
And, again, I think having them every meeting thinking, the information I'm learning here, where does it need to go? Because they should not be a stopping point for communication. They need to be the flow, right?
Yeah.
So where do I need to flow this information? Is it to maybe a colleague, into a different department? Is it up my line, or is it down my line? Or maybe it's all three, right?
Sure.
It could be all directions that they need to do that with. But I think too, if we think about supervisors, there's kind of that 3 methodologies for communication, where one is approaching things with curiosity, right? So approach with those open-ended questions. How, instead of approaching with, I'm going to tell people things, it is, I'm going to be curious about learning their perspective on things, right? So I think if they can learn how to be open and be curious about what others are doing and how they're approaching their work, it just leads into a better conversation than marching into a one-on-one or a meeting and being like, okay, team, this is what we're doing, right?
Yeah. Well, it also fosters innovation, right? Ideas.
Yeah.
Right? If we're not asking and saying, hey, inviting people in to think about work and how they're doing their work, you might be missing out on some great opportunities and ideas from the people that are doing the work that could propel your business even further. It all starts to be the willingness to people need to feel comfortable that they can share ideas and things won't be knocked down or right? Because no one likes to feel like, well, I'm not going to raise my hand if it's not appreciated.
Right. And I think, of course, there's times where supervisors need to give more direct feedback. So there are times where being open-ended and having that curiosity approach is very good, but there are also times where direct feedback needs to happen. And I think there's stats out there that say there's like 40% of managers are not comfortable giving direct feedback when they know the employee may react negatively. That's a problem. So, to really train supervisors on feeling comfortable in that uncomfortableness, right?
Yeah.
And understanding that, providing clear communication is more important than feeling uncomfortable. It is just again a critical piece of what HR needs to do and leaders need to do in that space.
That's where you can circle it back to kind of those building blocks of your values, right? All these reinforce the behaviors that you want. So being able to be receptive and seek feedback or seek even feed forward, like how do I take and receive this information, right? How do I propel that moving forward, right? And I think it's hard for folks, especially folks coming into the workforce too, to say, how do I learn how to hear and to receive, and how do we take it forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if supervisors can learn to approach it as, feedback doesn't equal failure, and even employees understand feedback doesn't equal failure, it's for future growth, right? That is really helpful. And I know when we do training for supervisors, we talk about like the 4-part formula of feedback, which is, you start with a micro question of, hey, can we talk a minute about how that project went or how that meeting went? So just a quick little, like it sets that person up for understanding, like, okay, we're going into a conversation about what happened, right? And then the second step is talk about the details. So what happened in that situation, and then the impact, right? So this had an impact on our organization, or it had an impact on our customer in this way. So, and be specific, right? So it's not an emotional conversation. It's very data-driven type of a conversation. And then you follow up with a question for understanding. Like, now that I've talked about this, what do you think, right? And then open it up for conversation at that point.
Yeah, that's cool. So when talking about supervisors, I think we've learned just in our experience and most of you folks out there that a lot of supervisors have grown into their role as a leader because they were top performers. And a lot of them haven't had formal training on how to supervise people, and communication being such a big part of that. Our role as HR, how can what does the role of HR have in fostering effective communication? And then, of course, supporting those leaders that may not be so well trained or versed or practiced in effective communication. What is our role in HR?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was actually just reading a stat about how HR practitioners usually are working on average 24 hours a week on communication. So we're experts in this area, believe it or not. So, we probably have some things to share with our supervisors and our leaders on how to be good communicators in this space. And I think, to me, when I see HR's role is really, again, defining and level setting with leaders and supervisors on the importance of effective communication and engagement. So being HR can be that conduit of constantly reminding leaders, like, this isn't extra work. This is the work of a leaders, right? So this is the thing that they should be focused on. And if they're not able to focus on it, we need to change up some priorities or accountabilities for our leaders, right? So I think that's one of, kind of reminding the executive teams or your leaders how important these things are, but then also doing training, right, for our supervisors so that they can feel comfortable in the uncomfortable, because it's uncomfortable giving kind of that bad feedback or critical feedback. And also reminding them that making sure they're generous with their praise and their recognition. So hit those on both sides. But then I think also with HR people, we can also, during an onboarding program, remind employees on here's how we communicate at our company. So here's our communication channels. You will receive both great feedback on recognition on the amazing things that you're going to do here. You're also going to receive some constructive feedback on some of the things that we're helping you to develop and grow into this role and maybe grow into future roles here at our company. And it's okay, right?
It's okay
To see both.
And we're on the journey, right? And
Yes.
we learn things from failure. And I think if you put that out, like we all, and even within your interviewing process, is like when, you know, when you have a stumble or a break, what's your takeaway? So it's fostering the implications of growth, right? You grow from experience, but let's have communication that learns from that. One of the things that we do I think from leaders, knowing anyone in a supervisory role, their accountability is really to lead, manage, and hold accountable your teams, right? So if you don't have the building blocks and the training to do effective management, effective leading, you know, I think it was a stat, most people don't get formal training until they're in their close to 40. And they probably have been a managers in their late 20s. So think about all that crucial time. Another stats are to say, you know, people leave more often than not because of their supervisor. Right. So let's invest. We should always be investing in our leaders and training.
I think some other nuts and bolts, just real quick on the HR piece, is tracking, right? So, you know, we're training, so now we have to track. So how do we track? Engagement surveys, pulse surveys, retention, turnover, looking through exit interviews, and, you know, even stay interviews. We talked the other day about skip interviews where, you know, maybe instead of meeting with your manager all the time, maybe you go one level up and talk to that person on how things are going within the company and within your team as well. So there's a lot of things I think that HR can do here to be a conduit for effective communication.
Yeah. I think what I'm hearing kind of as a theme throughout what we're talking about is really building that transparency and trust with your teams to foster that communication. Everyone has to have that, you know, psychological safety to be able to, you know, share their thoughts, their ideas. And even though it may not be, you know, something that gets moved forward or advanced with, everyone feels safe bringing up their, you know, having their opinion and having their say. So, you know, fostering that, you know, safe environment for everyone to have that open, honest communication with each other. So, yeah. So, I mean, wonderful advice. There's so many other ways. We have limited time this morning, but we do want to, you know, open it up to the group, want to break out to our breakout rooms and really want to know from all of you, what is working for your organization when it comes to effective communication? We've shared some ideas, but we know that there's, you know, infinite way that we can be effective with communication. We'd love to give you all an opportunity to share that with one another. So if you could all hang on to your seats, we're going to float you over into your breakout rooms well, I know you guys have all had some great conversation. Looking forward to hearing what's, you know, working well at your organizations. Took some time to review the notes from the different breakout groups, lots of similarities, some unique things. Looking forward to sharing with the group. All right, well, we're diving in. So really great conversation. Again, lots of themes. Some of the breakout themes that kind of rose to the surface for us as we were kind of tracking your conversations and notes is that weekly communication from senior leaders. So having that representation from the higher level leaders in your organization. And I noticed comments around having a newsletter, you know, having company email, using an HR, your HRIS for, you know, company-wide postings. Also saw a few folks mention, you know, using chatting apps, Zoom, WhatsApp, you know, even texting. And then for those that don't have company email or, you know, high tech folks, you know, just a shared area memo or posting that, you know, there's communication for folks to have access to. Notice the connection to senior leaders being really important as part of that. So including them in the onboarding with, you know, providing a welcome letter or card to new employees, taking time, you know, to have lunch with new employees and regular lunches with staff, having an open door policy and really executing on that, having them walk the floor or be out and about and be seen by staff to feel, that they can approach them and have conversation. And then also involve them in roundtables or focus groups. So they're part of that conversation with all levels in the organization. Identify and educate on the communication methods used by your organization. I think this is really important and should start at onboarding. What's appropriate channels of communication at our organization. And then of course, ask employees their preferred methods. Some folks may prefer email, some folks, just send me a chat, text me, call me, whatnot. And then specify which communication method is used for different types of communication. If there's a standard, if texting is one of the methods that you use for communication, texting is for urgent items, things that need quick action. An email, not urgent. You can check it. It's something that, action may or may not be needed. Using phone calls or in-person meetings for personal conversations or critical conversations, so that feedback. I also saw, having those intentional conversations among peers, leaders, workers, to get to know one another as people, not just coworkers or direct reports. So finding that common ground. Talked about larger organizations creating affinity groups, whether it be, hobbies or different interests. Focus groups or roundtables. We talked a little bit about involving leaders in those, but having them open to all employees from all parts of the organization to get different perspectives. I really like this one, an informal communication task force. I love that term, but it's a great way to identify influencers or folks that are highly regarded that may not be necessarily in a supervisory or leadership role themselves, but they can really expedite that timely communication and are well received by their peers.
Yeah, and one thing just on that, when you're thinking about change and change management and going through a major change, identifying folks that, you want to get onboarded or communicated quickly, because they will probably have more influence sometimes.
Yeah, especially when they're working in the trenches or right alongside them, right? That communication, they have that trust, that relationship built up. And then of course, I saw mentioned in a few of them having, formal supervisor training. So in being intentional about bringing in experts or having those that are have really great communication skills at your organization, work with new leaders or leaders that need their skills refined to build the skills and practices that foster that effective communication. What are the ways that we do that? So again, we went through all the wonderful notes and comments in there. I want to open it up. Any of the facilitators have a theme or topic that was discussed that we didn't capture here in the breakout that they think the group should hear?
This is Tara. I was in breakout group 4. One thing that we talked about, which I really liked, was the utilizing assessments to learn more about individual desires or how people communicate, how people are naturally inclined to work a certain way, doing that during onboarding or during the candidate process. And we talked about different, because there's so many out there, but we talked about different assessments that are available and having that be kind of a guide to identify how to better communicate or how people like feedback, or even if you're not going to do an assessment, asking the new hire or your employees, how do you like to be communicated with? How do you like to receive feedback?
Yeah, love it. Anything else?
I'm going to jump in really quick because I had 2 things that stood out in my group. This is Kaylin. We were in breakout room number 3. One of the items that someone brought up was the art of feedback. And so really building a consistent system around, okay, we've given feedback or we've communicated something, but then checking in to make sure that we're following up and the consistency in that. So employees know that like, hey, this is a message that we're trying to communicate and it gets through knowledge check-ins, and then just making sure that our supervisory teams, again, are leveraging the follow through. And then also someone was utilizing, when employees give feedback and are communicating to us, how do we make sure they know we're following through on what they've communicated? And so one of the organizations actually uses a logo on different projects that they're working on that are related to feedback that they've received so that employees know it's being worked on. It's just taking some time and it's kind of a work in progress. But that way they see a visual of, hey, my feedback is heard. It is being worked on, because we can't necessarily always communicate where we're at with the changes that we're making based on the feedback given in those surveys.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I think that kind of begs, the question too, is like when feedback is given, how do we receive how to receive feedback?
Yeah,
Great.
I think Lisa, you had a great way to, how do you prep a conversation, right?
Right, we were talking about that during the breakout on, we were saying earlier, it's uncomfortable for supervisors to give feedback, especially if they know it's gonna be kind of negatively received, right? So I think part of it is taking out the emotion. One of the ways you can do that is really just prepping your conversation by saying, this might be hard to hear. Like we're gonna talk about something that happened and it might be hard for us to talk about it. It might be hard to hear, but the reason that I'd like to talk to you about it is because you provide value in your role, or because I want you to grow in your role, or next time this happens, we can do better, right? So just kind of acknowledging the fact for yourself, the supervisor and the person, like, this is gonna be a tough conversation for us. We might, it's uncomfortable, but we're gonna get through it because there's an important reason why, right?
So critical.
Yeah, absolutely.
We want to definitely open it up to the rest of the team too. So of course, facilitators, if there's another theme that that you found that you want us to cover, or if any of our participants, if you have a question for the panelist or for the group as a whole, please utilize the chat function, throw it in there. I think we have nominated Tara to throw questions our way. I'm going to start with one that I have just in general, as we talked about these different channels of communication. But along with that, we also have so many generations in the workforce. What are some of the typical communication channels that you see organizations utilize to address or to communicate with all the different generations? I joke all the time, but I'm pretty sure my dad retired because everything everything had to be done on a computer or a cloud system. And he's like, you know what, I've been doing this by paper so long. I'm not going to learn this. I'm done. He also has a cell phone he never turns on unless he wants to call someone. So what are the different types of communication that you can use to address all different generations of workers in your workforce?
That's a great question.
And I think we hit some of the themes too, is to say on that onboarding process, have that intentional, we use chat to, quickly communicate something, quickly. Something that might be more formal might be an email. Something company-wide could even be a leadership doing a snippet video, right? Would be one way. Could be text, and it could be, hey, we're sending this out. Please respond yes or no to make sure that you received it, right? And then report back on it.
Yeah, and there's stats out there that say, again, like there's so much communication that's happening in a company, right? But we have to remember it's not quantity, it's quality.
Sure.
So being very clear about what communication channels that we use for what, and then making sure whatever that communication is, it's high level, right? Like it's quality instead of like, oh man, I'm just overloading, and you're constantly like distracting someone from the actual work they're trying to do because they're getting bombarded with email or text messages or memos and all of this stuff constantly, right? So there is a balance there a little bit.
There is, and I think we hit on something as well that came up with parameters of how we're delivering. So if it's the email and maybe you have a leader that, that their mode is to dive in late at night or, first thing in the morning before typical work hours, there's ways to, does the person who's receiving that feel like they've got to jump right back in because their phone, they're going to see it, right? So what are some of those things? Either sharing expectations. I'm not expecting you to respond, right this minute, or to say, can I take a step further and just do a delayed response, send it now. So
Yeah, I think that's key. And even to talk about that during an onboarding program, when you're sitting down one-on-one with your new person to say, you know what, sometimes at night, I just like to get some stuff off of my list. But you're not expected to really be connected in at that time. You'll see them in the morning because I might be jumping back into meetings first thing and I wanna, be able to have you continue to do the work that you do. But those scheduled emails or scheduled texts, those kind of things are so good for that type of situation, just to help people kind of guard their work-life balance in that space.
Yeah.
I think when it comes to generational too, again, I don't think there's one way we're gonna be able to hit all preferences,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
So I think part of it too is, again, going to the why we use the communication channels that we do, clearly identify when to use them, and then training, right? And it doesn't need to be a one-time training on how to use WhatsApp or how to use, Zoom or whatever. I know we're Zoom users here and we've done lots of training on how to do it because
And it updates, right? It
yes, the
updates all the
system
time.
updates and then there's new features and, so it's not a one and done situation. So, and giving people grace and understanding, like, there's gonna be a lot of people who catch on very quickly, to technology and others that don't. So walking alongside them and maybe giving them a mentor or a buddy, to say like, hey, if you have questions, here's a leader or maybe like an informal leader who's really tech savvy. They'd be happy to help walk alongside anyone for those questions.
Right, and I think we circle back to the managing structure of
Mhm.
things, because if you remember back when you first onboarded, you get a lot of information.
Mhm.
And how much are you, so we go back to, it takes 7 times, so how do we constantly reinforcing for everyone, this is how we're working, this is why we're working this way, and where are we going? So it's just crucial to keep that in mind,
Yeah.
so clarity will be clear.
So I wanted to clue you guys in on some of the conversation chats we're having. We're talking a lot about on the chat about having crucial conversations when you have to have those important, tough conversations with an employee and making sure that we're training, upskilling our managers to be able to manage that. And we've talked a little bit about how managers could respond poorly or not respond at all. Do you guys want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, we can do that. That's a big topic. So again, I think when we do supervisor training, a lot of times what we talk about for managers is prepare yourself, right? So when you know that you're going into a tough conversation, have your talking points ready to go so that you can make sure that you're getting across your points, right? So, and even as HR people, we can do some role playing. So if a supervisor comes in and says, hey, Lisa, I have this tough conversation that I need to have, or maybe the HR person's like, this person, you need to talk to them, right? So then you could do some role playing with that supervisor. Maybe it's not a super formal all supervisor training because those are, sometimes tricky to schedule. Maybe it's a one-on-one role play with that individual and help them create, like, here's the structure of your conversation. So that they stay on point, reminding them these are data points, things you can point to say, here's what happened, not a bias of my emotions or how I feel about someone, right? So as HR people, I think you can walk through that with them so that they're really well prepared for that conversation. And I always tell people, as a supervisor, you can take a timeout. So if you're in the middle of a conversation and you're getting frustrated, or you can see the person is getting frustrated, you can say, you know what, this conversation's going a little bit in a direction I wasn't thinking that was, or I think we should just take a timeout a minute. Let's reconvene maybe later on today, or let's see if we can grab HR or another supervisor and we can continue the conversation. Cause I can see it's going a different direction than I was anticipating, or I can see you're really frustrated with the conversation. So let's just take a time out a minute and we'll reconvene.
I like that because that's really giving someone some breath and, some way to say support, right? I have some other means to say if something unexpected is coming from this conversation, and to say, a pause is actually probably a great thing, and support.
Yeah, I think it's a great example of empathy too, as it being an empathetic leader, by saying, okay, that we're not getting the traction out of this conversation. So let's take a step back and regroup
Right.
later when we can be really effective in our.
Yeah, I think too, Tara, there's a lot that goes into, providing feedback and what you were saying earlier about knowing the person that you're talking with. So again, like, is this a person that you do need to be a little more direct with? Or if you're direct with a person, is that just going to crush them for the next 6 months, right? So it really is kind of knowing your team so that you can kind of approach that person in the way that will be the most effective for that individual. We all know the sandwich method. Some people take really, are some people that's really good for, right? You need to kind of do the prop up and then here's the issue and then the circle back. But other people that gets very blurry. So, some people just really need that more direct, like here's the detail, here's the point kind of a thing. So I think again, a part of it is understanding who the person is, their personality, so that you can approach them in the right way.
I think it is to be very clear, because sometimes I would think after success would be each party feels that they were heard, that's your point, but there's also some understanding and clarity of what's going to happen next, right?
Yeah.
An expectation.
I think too, a role for HR is, especially with supervisors who might feel uncomfortable or they're kind of new to their role, is again, not only the prepping, but maybe it's a sit-in, right? So maybe if it's appropriate, HR can sit in, but acknowledging to the person like, like the here comes the HR moment. Like, we don't want that, but it's more about like, hey, I'm just gonna sit in on this with Debbie today because we've already talked a little bit about this conversation, but I'm just here to support both of you as we walk through this situation, right? So hopefully they're not put on edge of like, oh my goodness, HR's here, I must be in real trouble, right?
Yeah, and that's the intention of us as HR leaders to make those connections with our coworkers, our teammates.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. What else, Tara? Any other conversations happening out there that we can add to or answer?
Yeah, so there was another question out there too, just about weekly meetings, like announcements, meetings for your company. What should you be communicating? So this person mentions that they typically just do like updates, but is there other things that should be communicated when your executive team is providing weekly communication? Like, what would be good?
Go ahead.
Right.
I saw you had something, so.
Well, part of it is having that right structure, right? So in our meetings, we have headlines, like these are some cascaded headline information that might have come from other teams or from leadership or bubbled up, right? So, and then we could, at the end of our meetings, to say, okay, here's information that needs to be relayed or cascaded. And so you has to have intentionality of, okay, how do we relay that information, right? And who's going to relay that information? So all that should be thought about to say, and then will people accountable to do it, right? So it kind of depends, but it says, yeah, we should share this information. But if you don't take it a step further and be really clear on the how, that's where you want to be.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think anytime you can connect any type of communication back to your mission or to values, is there some sort of headline that you can do for the whys, right? Is it maybe shout outs or kudos in that communication, type of situation, or we're starting this new project and it aligns with our mission of our organization because of X, Y, and Z type of thing as well.
And then also to say, does this information, are we just informing or are we asking that there's something that they need to then do and take forward and come back? So being very clear on what the information is about.
Yeah, I like that. It's a great opportunity to provide recognition or share personal, professional victories for individuals or departments or the company as a whole. Birthdays, anniversaries. I've also seen in weekly newsletters anything that's going on in the community or organizations that your company may support as well. To again, just encompass the full, 60 degrees of your people. So other things that they can get involved in outside of work, whether it's holidays or organizations that are near and dear to your company, or just how to get involved and without it's not an opportunity, it's not like a required participation from employees, but just to let them know what's going on outside of the workplace too, that those that may have an interest can get involved with and or go appreciate. So. And ask your employees what they want to know more about. I mean, honestly, you can ask your employees what would be meaningful in these newsletters, what would make it more, what information are you looking for from us? And if it's something you can provide, include it.
Actually, that's interesting. We've done that. And now that you say that, right? Because we have our weekly newsletter and there were times where we're like, is this hitting the right button? Right.
Yeah.
So it was like, what would you like to see in our newsletter? So, I think that's a really good point, Lisa, to make of like, if you're not sure what should be in your newsletter, then ask. So that way you're not wasting your time building something that's not valuable. So we want to make sure quality, not quantity.
Yeah.
So, if your weekly newsletters are not valuable, maybe it needs to be bi-weekly or monthly, right? So that way we're not bombarding some people with things that they don't find valuable.
Yeah. Great question. Yeah. The answer is we don't have the answer for every company, I think, but there's definitely some commonalities. What else? Any other questions floating around out there? A few more minutes if anyone's dying to know anything about communication.
There was another comment that Amy made from Heights Financial, which I actually really like this. I think it's good, is making sure that you're setting deadlines. Because I do think that's a trap that can happen when you're communicating. Sometimes you communicate something that you want somebody to do and you fail to set a deadline, and so it doesn't get done, and then there's frustration.
Sure, that accountability and follow through, follow up on that feedback or that communication, making sure that it's cascaded timely or that it's done effectively.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We talk a lot about that when we're going through coaching and counseling for, supervisors who are addressing the situation. And it always seems to be an aha moment to say, well, then set the deadline. Oh yeah, and it's like, it seems so simple, but it can be something that definitely gets overlooked when it comes to, even like performance coaching, like we need to see this by this date type of situation. Because otherwise you have now, when you set a date, then at that point you've set yourself up as the leader to be able to follow up and say, okay, did I see the improvement that I needed? Or did I get that information by the date that I needed it? And then if not, you can continue that conversation. So it's a really good point of like, again, the blurriness of feedback. So setting dates makes things very clear when it comes to expectations.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really important if it's not, especially if the communication is coming from a channel different than maybe a week. If you have a weekly touch base with your leader, with your internal team, that by next it's someone assumed that your to-do or your task is to be completed by the next meeting. But if there's a longer time period or something that's more urgent, clearly communicate, what do they say? Clear as kind. Just clearly communicate what the expectation is, when the deadline is. That way there's, no misunderstanding or misinterpretation of the message.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, absolutely.
So there is another question a couple of folks have, and it's Lisa Struck. It's for you. And based on you had your conversation earlier, when you were talking with us earlier, you had mentioned the 4-step process.
Yeah.
So folks would like you to go over those again so they can take some notes if you don't mind.
Sure. So yeah, the 4-part formula for feedback that we talk to supervisors about is, first, you start with a micro yes. So, hey, do you have a minute that we can talk, right? So what that does is and it's really a yes or no question. What that does, it kind of sets that person up for, okay, I understand that I'm stopping what I'm doing right now and we're going to have a conversation. So if it needs to be in the moment, or you could otherwise do it as an email and say, hey, do you have some time later on today? I'm going to schedule a 30-minute meeting for us, it creates buy-in for that person. So that's step one. So micro question. Then step two is provide the information on what happened, right? So, hey, I want to go over how that meeting with our client went yesterday. So that, you know, I'd like to talk about some pointers that I have for you and the things that I observed. So then you go through again, the data, the detail, right? And just kind of walk through that situation. Take out emotion, right? Take out anything there. And then from there, after you go through the detail, you follow it up immediately with the impact. So, you know, I noticed that after the meeting, the client was kind of confused by what happened, or, you know, whatever the impact of, you know, the situation, you know, like, because you did that, you know, we weren't able to get, you know, our orders out on time because, you know, you weren't able to get through your part of the work. So the impact there, you could tie that back to values in that space as well. And then the fourth piece is follow up with a question for understanding. So now that I've talked about the situation and how that impacted our company or our department, I'd like to hear, you know, do you understand what we talked about, or, you know, do you have questions for me? So just kind of another wrap up question to make sure that they understand. So depending on the situation, you could open that up to be more of an open-ended type question at the end. Or if it's a person that really you need to be very like, do you understand, right? So it really depends on the situation. You might need to be more of a direct yes, no, I get that and I will do better. Or let's talk a little bit more about how we can do better together and collaborate on the situation.
Great.
And then also too, could you talk about the 3 methodologies for communication? Curiosity.
Oh, yeah. So we talked about for supervisors, we talked about their really for supervisor for communication, it's really about being curious, right? So approaching things with curiosity, open-ended questions, right? So the how are things going, not the yes, no questions, open-ended questions in that space. You know, the second one would be clear feedback and timely feedback, using that 4-part formula if you need to, right? So having that clear and timely feedback for people so that they understand, like, am I off track on my accountabilities? Am I on track with my responsibilities? Did something go awry in that space? And then finally, the last one would be being generous with oh, I lost the word, with your acknowledgement and recognition. So with praise and recognition, that's the word I was looking for. So, you know, there's stats out there, right, that say you should give at least 5 to 7 points of praise or recognition for every more negative type or constructive feedback. So, you know, again, that's a really critical part of roles for leaders is it doesn't have to be anything fancy. It can just really even be an appreciation for somebody to do the simplest of things. Hey, thanks for making coffee. Every morning I come in and the coffee is made. Thank you so much, right? It can be all these little things that people do to get recognized for.
And that really adds up.
I thought I heard someone else wanting to ask a question or pipe in on but maybe not.
That was me, but I was asking the same question, so that's perfect.
Awesome.
Good.
Well, believe it or not, we're running short on time, and I know that we all have lots of things to tackle. Of course, if we'd love to consider or continue the conversation, if you'd like to schedule some time to talk about anything that, you know, we covered here today in more detail, or anything unrelated that we could possibly provide insight on, you can take a picture of our QR code there, schedule a free consultation. You can go to our website to do the same, and you'll be connected with one of our people strategists who can connect you to the right folks. Along with that, don't forget to save the date for our next collaborative cafe. We know that lots of folks are probably going to be enjoying summer, so we're giving you a little break until August. Our next collaborative cafe is going to be on combating burnout. Not sure any of you are feeling that at all or have it all in the last 3-4 years. But that will be on Thursday, August 22nd. It will be another virtual cafe from 8:30 to 10 in the morning. And with that, thank you everyone for your time here this morning, your feedback, your discussion, your collaboration with our team and with each other. We wish you all a wonderful day, a fabulous summer. Hope to see you around, chat with you soon, and absolutely see you in August.